Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasteraria@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject, but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or another. The subject from this particular episode was chosen by Eric, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation and for being patient with me for taking so long to get the last two parts of the series out. Now, if you'd still like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, and on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you'll get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released on the main feed. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you might listen to us, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, whatever. As always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the books Polio and American History by David M. Oshinsky, and most especially The Cutter Incident by Dr. Paul Offit, who also wrote a similarly named piece for the New England Journal of Medicine. It's actually a really big source, that book, for a lot of the stuff that I'm going to tell you in this episode and in the next one. Sources also include the Polio Crusade, an episode of The American Experience, and a video by OPENPediatrics on the iron lung. And before I proceed, I do want to issue a trigger warning yet again for mentions of the use of animals and aborted fetuses in medical experimentation. This does get somewhat graphic still, so I will try to give a heads up before I come to those descriptions. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 264, The Cutter Incident, Part 2, April 1955. 10 deceased, 40,000 injured. Okay, so before I recorded this episode and the next episode, I reshared the first episode in this series, where last we left our intrepid vaccine hunters. They had found a vaccine for polio, and it was huge. It was this huge celebration. So now we've got a vaccine. Sort of. Let's start off where we were at the end of the last episode, where Basil O'Connor and Jonas Salk arrived at Rackham Hall at the University of Michigan on April 12th, 1955. So did Thomas Francis, who produced the report on the findings from the study of the data generated from the vaccine trials done the previous year. So too did every reporter who could cram themselves into the room, their photographers, their notepads, their cameras, and probably their moms for the hell of it. Now, these sorts of press releases are usually pretty dry affairs. A guy like Thomas Francis stands up before an auditorium with a bunch of reporters, definitely not that many, God knows, and speaks for a long while about some of the driest scientific information you have ever heard in your entire life. It is a wonder journalists don't fall asleep during these things more often. Then again, maybe they did. In this case, the presentation was already bound to go awry. That day, Rackham Hall, with all of the necessary lighting and microphones, felt a lot like it was hosting the Academy Awards. Thomas Francis didn't even get a chance to start his presentation before someone had the bright idea to roll in a dolly piled high with copies of Francis's report. The reporters pounced on the reports like moms on Cabbage Patch Kids in the early 80s. Needless to say, they didn't wait patiently to hear Francis speak. They had his report right there, and they could quite literally skip to the end to find out that Jonas Salk's polio vaccine worked, which it did. While people were literally cheering in the streets for Salk and his vaccine that day, the Laboratory of Biologics Control, which licensed biologic products like the vaccine, saw an advisory committee go over exactly which companies would be allowed to produce the polio vaccine for public distribution. Now, we all know the companies which put out the COVID vaccine because we could see their names on the cards we kept with us. For example, United States, you have Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. In the case of the polio vaccine, at the time, the list came down to 5 different companies. The first was Eli Lilly, which also rolled out the first insulin production. It's a really big company, huge company. You've probably heard it, still enormous now. Park Davis, a pharmacist from which invented the Scoville test to tell you just how hot that pepper you're about to eat is going to be. They also had experience with making vaccines, so, another big company there. Wyeth, which would in the 1990s give us Fen-Phen, great for helping you lose weight, lousy if you want your heart to keep beating. Pittman Moore, which somehow doesn't have its own Wikipedia page or anything else. It's not something like all the other ones have some sort of reference for you to start with at the very least. Pittman Moore has nothing. So yeah. And Cutter Laboratories. These companies had not just been picked at random. They'd been a part of the selection process since the previous year when production of the vaccine for trials began. For the past year, those 5 laboratories had made lot after lot after lot, working on being able to make a polio vaccine with absolutely no infectious particles whatsoever in any of its doses. As we'll come to see, that turned out to be quite the task for each of the labs and Cutter Laboratories especially. So, who were Cutter Laboratories? Well, Cutter Laboratories was a family business founded by Edward Ahern Cutter in California in 1903. He had a pharmacy where he produced things like this, blood testing and that sort of thing. And then he moved to another place, made another pharmacy, and he was also doing that there. So he started kind of focusing on that, and that's where Cutter Labs began. Cutter had been making vaccines for decades for both animals and people. It started making smallpox vaccine the year after it opened. In 1904, it produced the rabies vaccine, and it was the first lab in the country to make the antitoxin for tetanus. Cutter also had the distinction of combining the vaccines for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, or whooping cough, into one shot. It put out blood products like plasma and churned out penicillin during the First World War. As resumes go, Cutter Laboratories had a pretty good one. By the time the polio vaccine rollout started, Edward Cutter's sons, particularly his eldest, Robert, were in charge of the business. He would put Dr. Walter Ward in charge of handling the production of Cutter's polio vaccine lots. So you have Robert Cutter, who is in charge of the company. He chooses Dr. Ward to handle all of this. As those 5 companies I mentioned earlier sat ready in 1954 to churn out the new polio vaccine, Jonas Salk provided a 55-page booklet describing each step of manufacturing his polio vaccine. Now, this is before they kind of decided which. They have this meeting and they announce that the vaccine is ready, and they come together to decide which laboratories are going to handle this. This is the year before, when they're still working on it, and they need laboratories to be able to be, ready to put this out when it comes out. So Jonas Salk has this booklet that he makes, and it goes step by step through the whole process of making his vaccine. I mean, 55 pages sounds pretty thorough, right? But there were a few slight details missing. For example, the protocol recommended 4 samples for testing during the process, but didn't say when to take those samples. Nor did it specify the type of filter, which would come back to bite them in the posterior later on. I tend to imagine these scientists going over the booklet feeling a bit like me when I saw a map up at work that had the names of Colombia, Macedonia, and Israel misspelled. So I grumbled and I wrote down the correct spellings on Post-its and I stuck them up on the map. But that map still just annoys me. It hasn't been changed. It hasn't been fixed. It's still there. It's not a life or death problem, the same way missing out a detail on making a life-saving vaccine might be. Salk hand-waved it as allowing the laboratories to stretch their legs to figure out a procedure that worked for them to produce the vaccine. And look, you can stretch your legs a bit with the recipe for Toll House cookies. I add pumpkin spice and maple flavoring, but that's cookies. Some of the folks working at the participating labs were more annoyed than grateful. They didn't want to play around with this. They just wanted a detailed recipe for something they absolutely did not want to screw up. Every one of the laboratories had their own issues making the vaccine, but Cutter had problems almost as soon as day one. To quote the Cutter incident, quote, 2 lots of vaccine made by Cutter didn't contain all 3 types of polio virus. Type 2 was mistakenly omitted. No other company committed this error. End quote. Scientists at Cutter Labs struggled to get the vaccine working while grumbling about Jonas Salk under their collective breath. One scientist from Cutter would say, "Every batch is like a damned research project." Now, prior to distribution for the field trial of the vaccine in 1954, samples of each lot the companies produced would need to be quality tested to make sure no live virus was found. One of those entities which would be making sure the lots were turning out safely was the Laboratory of Biologics Control at the National Institutes of Health. The lab was led by William Workman, and they mostly pushed more paper than beakers. Now, the National Institutes of Health at the time were under the Secretary of the Department of, I think it was Health, I know Health and Welfare, and I can't remember what the one in the middle is. I apologize. But the secretary for that was a woman named Oveta Culp Hobby. And she was Workman's boss. And Workman was the one who would be in charge of figuring out what exactly was, everybody was doing okay. Everybody was making this vaccine okay. All of that. So you have to think of the people who are in this laboratory of biologics control less like the guy who sits in your passenger seat and takes you through your driver's test, and more like the lady at the desk who takes your picture and hands over your license. This is not somebody who is hands-on, they're not it's not like testing vials or anything like that. They are mostly just going over math and things like that at the time. It's a lot of paperwork. It's just a lot of paperwork. And they are not used to, doing stuff like in an actual lab. Workman almost immediately starts hearing back from Park Davis and Eli Lilly that 2/3 of their initial lots still had live virus in them, even after the formaldehyde treatment, which we're gonna get to. All of a sudden you heard formaldehyde. Wait, what? We're getting there. So Workman shoots off a letter to Jonas Salk to suggest that, hey, maybe we should hold off for a little bit until we get this sorted out. Park Davis and Eli Lilly were very reputable when it came to making vaccines. And if they were having problems eliminating live virus, it was possible the other labs were too. And the last thing they needed was to rush this to the point where some bad lots might slip through the cracks, or worse, into the arms of small children. What followed was essentially Basil O'Connor and several big guys from the National Foundation and the NIH in a room together having a knockdown, drag-out argument over what the hell to do next. By the end of it, only a few days after Workman sent his letter, the decision was made that the company's vaccines would only be trusted after 11 consecutive lots went through without an issue. So no dumping a lot because it failed a test and not counting it. You get a failed safety test, it's back to lot 1. You have to get 11 in a row. Now, this might be stressful enough on its own, but then came the media. On April 4th of 1954, journalist Walter Winchell went on his radio show and told tens of millions of Americans that tests on Salk's vaccines showed that they were chock full of live polio viruses. Oh, and they killed some monkeys, which honestly makes one wonder if Winchell knew just how many monkeys had bit the big one to get to this point in developing a polio vaccine. Oh, and the National Foundation put a bunch of tiny white coffins into storage just in case they needed them, according to Walter Winchell, which anyone who's listened to this podcast long enough would know would have been quite an accomplishment considering the usual lack of availability for said tiny coffins. It's clear that some of that was true, but not all of it. But the scare tactic was enough to get a whole lot of parents who'd signed up their kids for the trials to be like, you know what? We'll wait for the next one, which is saying a lot considering summer and the now regular threat of the polio infection for American kids was just around the corner. The field trials of the Salk vaccine began on the morning of April 26, 1954, when a 6-year-old boy named Randy Kerr stepped up to get the very first shot in the trials in McLean, Virginia. Following him would be 420,000 kids who got the vaccine and 200,000 who got a placebo. Over 1 million kids would serve as a control group and got nothing. If you were one of the elementary school kids who received a shot, whether it be the vaccine or the placebo, you'd need 3 of them over a spread of 5 weeks, each in the left tricep. Got your shot? Here's your lollipop and your polio pioneer pin, which feels about as 1950s as it sounds. The depressing part of trials like this is that, unfortunately, someone's going to get hurt, or worse. To quote the Cutter incident, 16 children in the study died from polio. None of them had received Salk's vaccine. 36 children developed severe polio and had to be placed in iron lungs. Only 2 of the 36 had received Salk's vaccine. The vaccinated kids also were less likely to be paralyzed if and when they caught polio. As with most vaccines, when you take them, you may still get the disease, but with your immune system already armed and ready, it won't be half as bad as it would have been otherwise. There is completely the chance that if you get a vaccine for something, you may get that disease anyway. But the whole reason for the vaccine is to make sure that when you get it, your immune system knows how to fight it already, and they can just come in and beat it down. I had all of my COVID shots, all of them, and I get boosters for that sort of thing on the regular, and I have had COVID twice, but I have not had it to the point where it was as bad as it was for some people. I've had people who lost family members and people who are friends who lost, they lost husbands, fathers, all sorts of things like that. And it's terrible. But the 2 times that I had COVID were they bad? Yeah. Were they worse than any flu I ever had? Yes. Was it still better than not ending up in a hospital? Yes. Over the 2 weeks following the announcement by O'Connor and Salk, the polio vaccine produced by the 5 chosen laboratories would be distributed to children across the United States. So now we're back in 1955. They've come out, they've said they have this vaccine, and they are going to start shipping out this vaccine to kids across the United States. Now, immediately following the announcement, handling of the vaccine distribution passed from the National Foundation to the federal government, which we'll find out was a little bit of a problem. 380,000 doses of the vaccine made by Cutter Laboratories made their way to California and Idaho, where they were administered to children in 1st and 2nd grades. That was where most of their vaccines were to the West Coast and areas out there. There was other companies had locations that they were sending theirs to. Wyeth was sending some to the mid-Atlantic states, Ohio, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, that sort of thing. So everybody's got their places that they're sending their vaccines to. One of the parents who brought their kids in to get their polio vaccines was Josephine Gottstenker. Jonas Salk had been interviewed by CBS News correspondent Edward R. Murrow, and the interview inspired her to get her kids, their shots, before they headed off on a family trip. Her 2 kids, Jerry and Anne, were 10 and 5, respectively. On Monday, April 18th, they headed into the pediatrician's office. First, Anne got her shot, then Jerry. Anne received her shot in her upper right leg. The following weekend, the family would be going from Santa Barbara down to Calexico on vacation. The Gotstankers had a good time in Calexico. It was on the ride back that Monday as the family stopped for a snack that Anne shared that she wasn't feeling so hot. She complained of a headache, and in a moment, anyone who has ever had a little girl with long hair will recognize her mom suspected a simple solution. Her ponytail was simply secured too tightly. It's one of the things I do not miss about having long hair is how much that can hurt after a while. After they got back in the car, Anne threw up. Worried, her parents took her to the hospital. Her dad had to carry her in. By then, her right leg, the one in which she'd gotten her polio vaccine shot, had gone numb. First, it lost sensation in the upper portion where her shot had been administered, and then the loss spread to her lower leg. Fortunately, her brother was okay, so Jerry's fine. Anne has the problem, despite them getting their vaccines from the very same bottle of vaccine, the very same little vial. But Anne wasn't the only one experiencing what appeared to be the onset of polio, despite getting the vaccine only a week prior. Children in Idaho and California who'd gotten the new polio vaccine only a few short days earlier were developing all of the initial symptoms of the disease they'd been vaccinated against. Headaches, fever, weakening of the muscles. They kept popping up in hospitals and doctors' offices with numbness in the upper arms or upper legs, exactly the spot where they'd gotten their injections. On April 25th, the head of the Laboratory of Biologics Control, William Workman, got the first of a flurry of calls about a tiny problem with the polio vaccine. See, off in California, parents had rushed their kids to doctors' offices as soon as they heard there was a vaccine available for polio, just like the Gotstankers. They heard about the polio vaccine and that it was all tested and safe and they were done, and so they were like, okay, let's go get this for our kids right now. Summer's coming up. We really want to get this taken care of. Nobody wanted their kids to suffer the same as those poor children you would see in the newsreels, the ones with metal encasing their legs or their heads sticking out of iron lungs. So getting the polio vaccine was a no-brainer. You didn't want to get polio. It was a very rare thing to get it, but you didn't want to run that risk. The tiny problem, however, was that several kids in California ended up getting paralyzed in the arm or leg where they'd gotten the shot. A quick check of just who'd made those particular vaccines, those particular lots, showed that Cutter Laboratories had made the polio vaccines. The 6 specific children who were first found to be like this had taken. Workman called together people like Assistant Surgeon General David Price and Communicable Disease Center Chief Epidemiologist Alexander Langmuir to determine what would have been a question with a very obvious answer. How did these 6 kids get polio? Now, from the vaccine would naturally have been one of the main answers to consider, but let's keep in mind that we're coming at this with hindsight. But so too would be the possibility that out of tens of thousands of the kids who'd been jabbed over the preceding 2 weeks, these 6 already had polio in their system before their injection. Polio was still going around, after all. It was the reason they invented the vaccine in the first place. It was entirely likely a few kids would come in to get the vaccine with polio virus already in their system. There were also, it would turn out, several pieces of information that particular group of men who gathered that day, Alexander Langmuir, the Assistant Attorney General, Surgeon General, William Workman, all of these people did not know about the production of the vaccine and specifically about how badly Cutter had been doing it. Still, the kids who developed polio did so days after getting their shots, and it affected the point where they'd been injected, like with Anna Gotstanker. The problem was the lots from Cutter. Now, the ball was in Surgeon General Leonard A. Shields' court. Were they going to just stop the vaccine rollout to a screeching halt? Were they only going to do it for the Cutter lots? And what about the public image of celebrating the creation of this vaccine only to immediately dial it back because at least some of it wasn't working? There were over 150,000 doses of the vaccine still out there. Were they supposed to destroy them all and start from scratch? And unfortunately, they couldn't just make Cutter Labs recall their lots. Legally, now that Cutter Labs were licensed to produce the vaccine, they could just keep doing it even if they knew about the kids who'd already caught polio from it. Surgeon General Shield decided to request by telegram that Cutter Labs, quote, discontinue distribution of poliomyelitis vaccine until further notice and to withdraw all issued unused packages from the market, end quote. Credit where credit is due, Cutter Labs turned around in about 40 minutes of receiving the telegram and issued a recall to everybody who'd received their vaccines but hadn't yet administered them. You got anything from Cutter Labs you haven't used yet? Send it back. Send it back to us. We need it back. But the vaccine had been out there for 2 weeks now, and 380,000 doses of the Cutter vaccine had already been administered. Even as unused supplies were being sent back to Cutter Labs, more victims of their vaccine rollout were turning up. Idaho, Washington, Illinois, Colorado, California, all of them were seeing kids who'd gotten the Cutter vaccine and showed signs of polio within a few short days. Now, depending on where they were, you were seeing more signs of kids who had gotten the shots getting the virus. So California was getting harder hit. Idaho was getting harder hit. These other states were also getting cases of polio in kids who had gotten the vaccine, but it wasn't as bad as it was in like Idaho and California. Those were the worst off. Idaho only received polio vaccine from Cutter Labs. And by the time the recall was announced, 32,000 doses had already gone directly into the arms and legs of nearly all the state's first and second grade students. Keep in mind, they have to take 3 doses of this. So this is like the first dose for most of these kids, nearly all of these kids, as I understand, is the first dose. And then you would get these 3 doses. The second dose backs up the first dose. Third dose backs up those 2 other doses. And after those 3 doses, you should be able to fight off polio. But, you know, you're talking about 32,000 doses, excuse me. That is 32,000 kids. Pretty much at that point. That's 1 kid for each dose. It is not double dosing at that particular point. You know, you kind of have to wait and see, you know, there's just so many kids going. So it's more than likely that, you know, those doses were going into 1 kid. You know, you get 1 in everybody and then you go on to the next stage. So it didn't take long for the Cutter vaccine's flaws to pop up in Idaho's kids. First was Susan Pierce, a little girl in Pocatello, who received the vaccine with her brother on April 18th. Within days, she began to experience the usual litany of polio symptoms. First, stiffness in her neck and a fever, then paralysis in her left arm. On April 25th, she needed to be placed into an iron lung, but the treatment failed to keep Susan alive, and she passed away only 2 days later. By the first week of May, there were a handful of children in Idaho suffering from paralysis, if not worse. 2 children died there that week, Danny Eggers and Janet Lee Kincaid. Elsewhere, young Eugene Davis, whose grandfather was the first doctor to link smoking and lung cancer, was administered a shot of the Cutter vaccine given as a sample to his grandpa. Eugene didn't survive. It would have been bad enough if those injected with the vaccine were the only ones affected. But viruses like to spread, and spread these did. On May 9th, a young mother in Atlanta died after catching polio from her infant, who she brought into the doctor for their vaccine. Another mom who was 8 months pregnant ended up getting polio from her vaccinated toddler son and passed away on May 12th. 74 relatives of children injected with doses of the vaccine from Cutter Labs ended up developing paralysis after having it passed on by their supposedly vaccinated kids. 10 people died as a direct result of the live polio vaccine administered to thousands of Americans in April of 1955, 5 of whom who'd received the vaccine and 5 they passed it on to. 40,000 of those who'd received Cutter's vaccine developed the lesser version of polio with headaches, fever, and weakened muscles, not including people in the families and communities of the supposedly immunized kids who caught polio from them. 51 of the kids who'd received the vaccine and 113 of those who caught it from them ended up with permanent cases of paralysis. between those who were injected with the vaccine, members of their families, and those they interacted with, the over 200,000 people ended up developing or catching the live polio virus contained in Cutter Labs vaccine, with 70,000 of those people developing some level of muscle weakness. While plenty of people might hold their tongue about such a serious situation, Albert Sabin wasn't going to. He simply would not be able to suppress his "I told you so's." Albert Sabin sometimes comes off a little bit like a jerk in this story, but he's not wrong. He's not wrong a lot of the time when he is criticizing the way that some of this rollout is happening, some of the ways in which Jonas Salk was producing this vaccine and getting it out there. And so he did have, room to criticize, certainly, but he wasn't being very polite about it. But in this particular case, I think considering the danger to people in the neighborhoods, to people in the families of these kids, to the kids themselves, it really was a very serious issue, and maybe a little rudeness was in order. So I'm going to save the rest of this particular explanation for the next episode, because it's going to get really, really complicated. There's like math and a lot of really tiny little details that I'm going to have to get into. So it's going to include a lot of focus. But essentially at this point, what you have is you have a country that is going to start realizing very quickly that those vaccines that are going out are infecting some of the kids who are getting them. That Walter Winchell, when he went on the radio and he's saying all these things about, all these problems they had producing the virus, and they have all these little tiny white coffins, like there was a grain of truth in what he was saying. And so when you see, later on down the line, when the vaccines start to be administered, they start to be released, you have this big, huge rollout. And now the parents who the year before were afraid of the vaccines are seeing feedback where, yeah, maybe they were right to be afraid of the vaccine. Now, that's not entirely accurate. They weren't right to be afraid of the entire vaccine, but there were issues. And I think that it has to be noted before we go into the next episode, and trust me, I do have it written somewhere in my script, basically the same thing towards the end of this, but the thing about medical history is that it is filled with screw-ups and mistakes and people intentionally or unintentionally making things that don't work. Doesn't mean that they're evil, doesn't mean that they're trying to make a buck, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but the history of medicine is just absolutely a mess. And vaccines are not like by themselves in having some problems in their past in regards to who was treated, how vaccines were made, how people got them. There are other stories that are contained in the book, The Cutter Incident, that I did not put in the script, where previous releases of vaccines, different vaccines, not just the polio vaccine, but other ones, had some issues. Keep in mind, the vaccines that we're talking about are only, at this point, like 50 years old. The versions that we're talking about, in terms of inoculation and that sort of thing, you're going back, at least 100 years, if not more, with smallpox and all of that. But in terms of modern-day vaccines, things like rabies and antitoxins for that sort of thing, and all of that, it's more recent. And so the science, when this is happening, is still being worked through. And even today, we are still working through changes and improvements upon vaccines to make sure that they are safe for everybody. Does that mean that they are always going to be perfect? No, nothing is always perfect. But in this particular case, you have Cutter Labs making some mistakes, which clearly harming the people that they are trying to help. There were also things like vaccines that are mentioned in the Cutter incident where they tried to give people a vaccine against diphtheria, or children a vaccine against diphtheria, but the way that they were able to obtain the virus that was used to make that vaccine, they got it from somebody who already had hepatitis, I believe. And so a bunch of these children who had gotten this vaccine for diphtheria ended up getting hepatitis because of that. And it was similar stories along the way where people were trying to make these vaccines and somebody would screw up. And somebody would do something to make this vaccine where they were trying to treat one disease, and maybe it got contaminated with another vaccine, with another disease, or they accidentally chose the wrong one. It's a lot of problems like that. Now, vaccines, like I said, you're going to have a history just like any other aspect of medical history. They have all kinds of questionable things. One of my favorite things to read about is medical history. And you find stuff like this throughout history where medicines and surgeries and treatments, diets, all kinds of different things are suggested to cure things or to help you, and it doesn't really work out, or it seems ridiculous. You look back on it now and you're like, why did people do that? And it's a lot like that now in regards to certain medical treatments that we have. In regards to vaccines, we're looking at this story through the lens of people who just went through a worldwide pandemic. And there are still a lot of people, God knows, who do not trust vaccines and did not trust the COVID vaccine because it was developed so quickly as far as they understood it. The thing is that with science, with things like this, the funding for people who are looking into this sort of thing is not good unless something terrible happens. Like, to get the funding to do the sort of stuff that you need to do to come up with something like the COVID-19 vaccine as quickly as possible is that information was out there. The information to make that vaccine was out there. It just wasn't getting any funding. One of the people who got the Nobel Prize for helping to develop the vaccine, if I remember the story correctly, she worked on all of the sorts of things in years prior to that, which would lead to being able to make that vaccine. But she was working at Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, I think. Don't quote me on it. I haven't looked this up. But she was working at one of these colleges or universities, and again, funding, it's not attractive, it's not interesting, there's not any sort of pandemic this can work for, or epidemic this can work for, and so she got canned. And turn around a couple of years later, and the information that she was able to study and research and come up with helps develop this vaccine very, very quickly because the tools were there. It's just that you can't pick them up, or at least you don't have the money to pick them up or to buy them or whatever until something bad happens. So once something terrible happens, that's when people start to invest in this sort of thing in science. There's all kinds of talk about big pharma and that sort of thing. A lot of people who complain about, big pharma and all of that. But a lot of people who are doing the really interesting research and the things that move things along are doing so in places where they are not getting huge funding, where they are not getting a lot of attention or a lot of money or anything like that. Most people aren't getting rich doing this sort of thing. So when it comes to the polio vaccine and Salk's vaccine in particular, Salk was lucky to be researching this vaccine and working on this vaccine at a time where you had the National Foundation who were like throwing money at people to develop a vaccine to get it done as quickly as possible. That doesn't happen a lot. That doesn't happen a lot for vaccines unless something terrible happens and, say, a worldwide pandemic comes along, and then all of a sudden they start throwing money at the people who know exactly what they're doing and who know how to come up with this sort of thing. Does that mean that they're always correct? No. But in this particular instance, you had Jonas Salk coming up with a vaccine and doing so in a way where the process had several issues. And it was whipped together so quickly that those issues didn't become clear until this rollout starts and people start dying. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to move on to the next episode and it's going to be really, really complicated. So bear with me. There's just a lot of math and a lot of explaining science. So sit back. I'm going to try to make this as easy to understand as possible. And if you are on the Patreon, you will be lucky enough to get the next episode immediately. I'm putting 3 episodes out tonight on the Patreon. But if you are on the main feed, it won't be coming out for a week. So keep in mind, if you want to listen to the new episode, you can just sign up for the Patreon and you will be able to listen to the new episode and the episode that will be coming after episode 3 of this one, which I am also finishing tonight and posting. So until next time, guys, stay safe.